Hi, I'm Bernard Leong and you may know me as the executive who wants to stop driving and sit on a self-driving electric car, and in my spare time I want to find out about the state of electric cars in China and why companies like Xiaopeng Motors are poised to give Tesla a ride for their lives. You're listening to Analyze Asia, the weekly podcast dedicated to business, technology and media in Asia, and today I have Raymond, founder of Transformative Technology Academy and host of TechBuzz China podcast. Welcome Raymond, and it's great to have you back here again on Analyze Asia.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back.
And since our last conversation, what have you been up to?
Well, I've been working continuously on the podcast, so we are not quite at episode 300. We are close to approaching episode 50, and we celebrated our 1-year anniversary. Yeah, so that's been really fun.
Congratulations on your episode 50, and you have also gone bi-weekly with your episodes as well, right?
Yeah, just like the weekly output was too much.
And I think very interesting thing, I've been listening to your podcast and I like the episodes regarding influencer marketing, like Ruhan that you all talk about. You want to talk a little bit about what you have done with that particular sector that I think is not very well covered in the rest of the world from China?
Yeah, that's what we've been trying to do. So first of all, we are now really trying to focus more on larger companies. So either newly public companies, internet giants, or companies that are close to becoming public. And again, the thesis is that we are trying to focus on sectors that are, relatively speaking, undercovered in English press, but are sort of a big deal in Chinese press. And so, for example, the influencer marketing company talked about, that was actually a pretty small IPO, but it made a big splash in Chinese media because of the fact that it was the first of its kind to go public. And I think also it's one of the examples of where, in some sense, that sector in China is actually far more developed, or at least far better monetized than in the rest of the world. And that's what we've been focused on.
I felt it's also very underappreciated in the US because the equivalent of these companies are not IPO and doesn't reach that kind of scale that you see in China.
Yeah, no, they're generally still, Series A, Series B companies. Whereas you mentioned Ruhan, it actually went public in China first and then delisted and then recently relisted in the US.
And I also like the episode on Jewel of China, the one on e-cigarettes. I mean, I totally didn't realize that it's actually only owned by, I think, somewhere between 4 to 10 tobacco companies, and they are not even in the e-cigarette category.
Yeah, we thought that was interesting too. Actually, that trend's been going on. I think we said in the episode for a while that everyone's been saying this is the next big thing, especially now that smartphone penetration has reached sort of a all-time high, and then there's less to do in that industry, so you actually see a lot of the entrepreneurs or founding employees who've started smartphone companies go into e-cigarettes, since a lot of the concepts are similar.
So Raymond, I got you here today. Actually, I have listened to one of your podcast episodes on NIO, which you talk about NIO, the electric car company in China that has recently gone public. But instead of just building on that story, I've decided that I would like to take a different angle to the story so that we can go into a much deeper conversation on the state of electric vehicles in China. So I'm going to start with the story of Xiaopeng Motors because you talk a little bit about it during your podcast. So I'm going to use this opportunity to actually expand that conversation. So I will see that as a compliment to your episode in TechBuzz. So I want to start off by just giving the audience an introduction. Xiaopeng Motors is an electric car company which has recently raised somewhere around 4 billion RMB, which is the equivalent of a US 587 million depending on the exchange rates, backed by Alibaba Group and a lot of prominent investors. And unlike NIO, is also a step up to go into what is called the luxury electric car segment. And Tesla is also in town now. So to start off the conversation, maybe I want to get an understanding of Xiaopeng Motors. Can you tell me a little bit about the vision and mission of this company? And I think the founder, He Xiaopeng, is a very interesting character. So maybe we start from Xiaopeng Motors and then we go into his background from there.
Yeah, sure. So Xiaopeng Motors is often mentioned in the same breath as NIO, which is the company that we did do a podcast on last fall when it went public in the US. So the NIO, that's spelled NIO. So Similar to NIO, and part of the reason why they're sort of generally mentioned in the same breath is because they are both founded by serial entrepreneurs who come from the internet space, so not from the automotive space. And also, like NIO, they're backed by sort of internet giants, right? So in the case of Xiaopeng, it started by He Xiaopeng, who was a serial entrepreneur, and his company was acquired by Alibaba. So when he spun out and, started Xiaopeng, an electric vehicle company, he was backed by Alibaba. And one of the main missions that he has is he believes that, in China, we talk about in the tech space that China leapfrogged sort of the PC era and sort of went straight into mobile internet. You see entrepreneurs applying that sort of metaphor to their startups all the time. And he believes that there's now the time for electric vehicles to also go straight into the mobile internet era. So what he says is, Tesla was started over 10 years ago before, smartphones became popular. But now Xiaopeng, being started just a few years back in 2017, has opportunity to build a car from scratch and completely reimagine the vehicle. To give you some examples of what he's talking about in their latest sort of product release, he talks about how Xiaopeng is, of course, going to have an autonomous driving system, but the intelligent vision system that they're going to have is going to have, for example, recognize the driver's face automatically and then adjust the settings based on, the driver. And also they're going to have personalized seating, navigation, music, and other settings, be able to hold more than one account. And then it will also log that specific driver account and to ensure that the driving record is private and safe. Xiaopeng also said it'll have an in-car smart camera, and then, basically planning to have a lot of features that will basically have a truly smart car. And he likens most cars today to sort of functional flip phone, and he believes Xiaopeng can have all the software and engineering that's available now to make it sort of the truly smartphone of electric vehicles. And then going on, Bernard, you asked about the chairman himself. The chairman, like I said, was one of the main founders behind UC Web. He was actually the technical co-founder, and UC Web was China's leading mobile web browser. So it was founded in 2014. It had mobile search, gaming, mobile reading, etc. When it was acquired by Alibaba, it had more than 66% market share in China. And it was also one of the leading browsers in India, as well as many other countries. It actually had over 500 million users. And when it was acquired by Alibaba, that was the largest acquisition in Chinese tech at the time. That was about $4.3 billion. And that made He Xiaopeng into a billionaire. So after UC Web was acquired by Alibaba, He Xiaopeng served there as an executive for a while, but ultimately decided to leave to start his own company in electric vehicles. And the company, Xiaopeng, is named after himself.
Thank you for giving the background of He Xiaopeng. I mean, UC Web is probably something equivalent of the level of Mozilla Firefox or Chrome browser because of such a huge market share within China itself. I want to start by understanding the structure behind Xiaopeng Motors a bit more. Does Xiaopeng Motor build their own cars? Where and how do they produce their electric cars? Because how I understood it was that NIO doesn't do it by themselves. They contract it to someone to do contract manufacturing. Or are they in the same line of thinking as well?
Yeah, so Xiaopeng and NIO are very similar. Both currently use a contract manufacturer to make their cars, but both have plans to set up their own manufacturing plant. So Xiaopeng right now, they manufacture their Model G3 at a manufacturing plant owned by Haima in China. For their own manufacturing base, it's currently under construction, and they expect the facility to be completed by the end of this year. But basically, the reason why both these companies are going with contract manufacturers is, as you can imagine, it takes a really long time and it's quite expensive to make your own facility. NIO, by the way, works with JAC, which is another large automaker in China. They actually recently announced that their plans for their own facility would be delayed, and that actually led to a drop in their stock price. But anyway, back to XPeng. Right now, the employees at XPeng are primarily engaged in R&D, so not too much manufacturing staff. In fact, they recruited over 2,000 people in 2018, and 70% of them work on R&D, right? Because they are making their own software, their own operating system, etc. When He Xiaopeng spoke at the Boao Forum in China, which is, sort of like China's version of the, World Economic Forum or whatever, he said that his target was to increase production from 1,000 vehicles to at least 3,000 per month. And he is hoping that he'll be able to deliver 10,000 cars by July. Just to give your listeners a sense of the scale of that number, that's actually not very much, right? So XPeng just started delivering their cars at the beginning of this year. It's an SUV that they're making right now, and they want to ultimately be able to make 1,000 of them per week and 40,000 by the end of this year. In comparison, Tesla, which is like the leading electric car vehicle everyone compares themselves to, Tesla produced almost 90,000 vehicles in the fourth quarter alone. So XPeng in the whole year is going to be producing less than half of what Tesla made in one quarter. But that's still pretty good for, a first year in operations.
And they sold about 4,800 cars based on the numbers that I think you were sharing with me before the podcast, right?
Yeah. XPeng has disclosed that they've sold about 4,800 cars so far. By the way, when NIO went public, they had just started delivering cars, so it was well less than 1,000. So XPeng is, like I said, these two companies are often compared to each other, is a little bit behind, but not too far behind.
I would probably just add one more number, is the number of cars that's made by Toyota per year. Based on what I understand from some of the analysts out there, Toyota, being the largest manufacturing of the normal petroleum cars or hybrid cars, actually produces up to 250,000 cars per quarter, up to 1 million cars per year. Separated, of course, globally across different parts of the world with the different markups. And I think this is a very interesting comparison, how far Tesla is with regards to Toyota. It's now producing almost 1/4 of the number of vehicles, which is pretty impressive given how far they have come. But I guess the more interesting question is, recently they've unveiled their latest car, which is a G3 in CES, and the car is priced at about US 47,000 compared to a Tesla Model 3 is priced at US 30K, except that I think in the business model for Tesla Model 3, the charging actually you have to pay for it. So can you talk about the different car models which they've done so far and what are they doing with that?
Yes, so the Tesla Model 3 is a sedan, but actually for both NIO and XPeng, they're starting off with SUVs. However, both of them have also promised they'll be shortly launching a sedan. And for XPeng, that sedan is going to be called the P7. It's going to have 370-mile range, and a lot of the features are actually very similar to Tesla. So it's going to have sort of hidden handles. It's going to have, very aerodynamic design, and it's going to have a 0 to 60-mile acceleration of just 4 seconds. And it's going to have all the new gadgets like chips from Qualcomm and NVIDIA, etc. At least this is what was announced at CES. I actually don't know if that's going to be affected by the trade war. That's actually something maybe interesting you can consider. But for NIO, it's also the same, but they have released less details than XPeng on their sedan, which is going to be called the ET7. And NIO and XPeng, like I said, both are mass producing currently right now SUVs. For NIO, they have a newer version called the ES8, which they're just starting to receive deposits back in December of last year. Like I said, for the price that we're talking about, which is a XPeng car at $47,000, you are actually getting an SUV, not a sedan. So that's one of the key differences between actually XPeng and NIO, which is that XPeng's cars are significantly cheaper. In fact, if you look at the basic models, they're about half the price of a NIO, which is I guess if you think about it, more directly comparable to the premium brand image that Tesla is going after.
That's interesting. So I want to just take a little slide back to William Li Bin, NIO's celebrity founder. I guess according to your podcast, and you mentioned that he actually created a car company out of PowerPoints. And there's some very interesting rivalry between Li Bin and the other EV car company founders and tech founders. So can you talk about him as a personality and why is he so interesting in terms of being a founder of an electric car company then?
Yeah, so William is often called in China as sort of the godfather of transportation. And that's because he had a pretty successful track record as both an entrepreneur and investor in this space. So he started a company called BitAuto, which is a publicly listed company, focused on the automotive space in China. That company do not make any cars, but they operate a website that is car related. So if you go to the website, you'll see that it's sort of like Cars.com, Consumer Reports, and Auto Trader all rolled into one. And like I said, this company has been publicly listed for a while. But besides that, he's also been investing in a lot of companies, and some of the unicorn companies he's invested in you might have heard of. One of them, for example, is Mobike, the bike sharing company in China that was sold to Meituan for almost $3 billion last year. He was actually one of the co-founders, as well as angel investors. And I really call him a co-founder because the story goes that this really was his idea. And he had a lot of very specific product vision for the company. He just didn't join on an operational level. So his investor track record is quite good. He has 5 unicorns out of 32 investments. And that's why he's called the transportation godfather. When you were referring to the fact that some people say he's created a car company out of PowerPoints, they're really referring to the fact that, well, first of all, when he went and raised money, people gave him money without him actually having a prototype. But I would say that's pretty typical, right, of people who are making cars. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of money to make a prototype. But also, like I said, when NIO went public, it had actually just started delivering cars. So he had basically raised hundreds of millions of dollars before anyone had seen a single car. And that reminded people of another famous entrepreneur called Jia Yueting in China, who started a company called Le Echo, actually. And that company was trying to make a car called Faraday Future. And it turned out to be effectively a scam, a fraud, because he also raised billions of dollars, but he was unable to deliver even a working prototype. So a lot of people in China were quite burned from Jia Yueting's false promises and considered a lot of the electric vehicle entrepreneurs to be sort of full of hot air. So they were very skeptical when William, came out and said he was going to make an EV. Luckily for us, NIO has not turned out to be a fraud and is actually delivering cars. But that hasn't stopped some people from, like I said, calling this entire space, by the way, not just William, to be entrepreneurs building companies out of pure PowerPoint.
And this is pretty interesting, right? Because now if we start expanding the scope of the EV market in China a little bit out, just beyond XPeng and there is also WM Motor, there's also Byton, and there's also BYD, which is actually a battery company, but now I think is an electric vehicle company as well. So I guess my first question is, how are these EV car companies differ from each other in terms of how they approach the large Chinese market?
Yeah, so the really quick answer is that existing manufacturers, for example, like BYD, who's been making electric vehicles for a long time, they are focused on a completely different market, and their cars look very, very different from the sort of EV startups that we're talking about, like XPeng and NIO. So most of those manufacturers, and there are tons of them in China, are making cars that are very simple. They're battery powered, but other than that, they really don't have anything in common with what you might think of as sort of the next generation EV, like a Tesla. They're very simple. They're generally around $10,000. And honestly, if you look up photos of them on the internet, to me, they really look more like golf carts, right? They're very small. They look like the Mercedes smart cars or maybe the Fiat 500 series. They're not like your fancy Model 3s or Model X's or whatever. However, for Byton and Weima, those are direct competitors to Xiaopeng and NIO and, in a sense, Tesla. They really are making the next generation sort of very intelligent, very smart electric vehicles. The difference is that they have a slightly different model. So earlier, remember, we were saying that Xiaopeng and NIO are starting off by using contract manufacturers. Well, both Weima and Byton are starting off with their own manufacturing facilities. So it is taking them a bit longer, right? However, because they are making their own facilities, the argument is that they'll have more control over the process, and hopefully that leads to better results in the long run. Weima is funded, by the way, by Baidu. It's got a similar price point as Xiaopeng, so we're talking about, starting off at the mid $30,000 range, and it's already raised $3.3 billion, including a last round this March. Byton, which I also think is really, really interesting, is actually started by not Chinese entrepreneurs, but foreign entrepreneurs. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a Chinese EV startup, although a lot of the funding has come from China. They're started by BMW veteran Karsten Bretfield, and he has put together a truly international team. So they have R&D here in Silicon Valley, manufacturing in China. And while they're seeking to start selling their cars in China, they plan to shortly thereafter also sell in the US and Europe. So they're really trying to be a global company from day one. Also, they are generating buzz because last year at CES, they announced that they were developing their own vehicle operating system, app ecosystem, and interface. And their car has like this huge screen, if you look at the prototype, and they're going to be collecting information like monitoring your health while you're driving in the car. So it's really, really different, actually, in terms of their vision, even more advanced, I would say, than Xiaopeng or NIO.
Just to complete the picture, I think Weima is WM Motors and it's also funded by Baidu, right?
Yes, Weima is funded by Baidu.
So the BAT have complete entry into electric cars. I mean, Xiaopeng is funded by Alibaba, NIO is funded by Tencent, and Weima is funded by Baidu. Complete.
Yes.
Okay, I'm also very curious to know, given that the Chinese government has been thinking a lot about going green, have they, like the US government during the Obama era, been supportive of EVs, like offering similar types of incentives and subsidies for the Chinese consumer?
Yeah, for sure. So the Chinese government was really trying to support the industry. And one of the main things they did, like in the US, was offer a consumer subsidy. And that ranged from about $2,000 to over $7,000. And that was dependent on the range of the car. So the longer the range, the higher subsidy, because, the more complex the vehicle is. They also had a thing where you could get a license plate much easier if you bought an electric vehicle. So in China, in many of the tier 1, tier 2 cities that are very crowded, you can buy a car, but you actually need to go through this whole process to get a license plate for your car and be able to drive it within city limits. That process is called Yao Hao. So for most vehicles, it was like a lottery system, and you could actually wait years before you acquired a license plate. But for electric vehicles, most cities, including, for example, Beijing, allowed you to just simply apply for the license. It was just sort of like waiting in line. And because not that many people were buying electric vehicles, you had a much higher chance of getting a working license plate if you did buy an EV. However, I do want to say that the Chinese government is now really slashing subsidies, and they have the intention of eventually eliminating all the financial support in this industry. And the reason is that they want the industry to be more globally competitive. And, giving subsidies is sort of a crutch. It helps the industry get started, but you don't want to do that forever, or else your companies are not going to be, as competitive. So in March, they announced that the subsidies are basically, you can consider it as basically being cut in half. And that actually really affected NIO's stock price because people saw slowdowns, are expecting further slowdowns of car sales.
And so NIO is affected because of the loss of the subsidies. But how about the other companies? Are they okay in terms of when the subsidies is removed? Or do they also are affected in the same way as NIO? I guess a rising tide lifts all boats, but it can also sink all boats as well.
Yeah, I mean, NIO is the farthest ahead at this point in terms of cars delivered. So Xiaopeng, actually, we can see their monthly sales, and maybe it's because they're just ramping up production. It doesn't look like they've been affected, but the other two haven't even started delivering cars. The other two new electric vehicle startups that we're talking about haven't actually started delivering, so we don't know. So far, doesn't seem that people have slowed down deposits for them, but again, these are pretty high-end vehicles, so not like hundreds of thousands of people rushing to buy these cars yet.
I'm very curious to know, what is the business model for Xiaopeng Motors? Is it similar to Tesla and NIO, or does it have its own way of making a purchase? So like, for example, Tesla, you have to go to their own showroom. You can buy it directly from them. I mean, in some US states, based on the policies, they can't even actually sell without going through the distributor. So what they do is they have Tesla clubs where people just go in and see the car and then they make the purchase. I guess for Xiaopeng Motors and NIO, do they have the same situation, or are they doing it differently in China?
I would say the business model in terms of how they're selling the cars, yeah, it's very similar. Xiaopeng, NIO, and Tesla, they're all controlling their own sales channels. NIO in particular is building these sort of high-end, they call it NIO House, which is almost like a clubhouse for their owners and fans, enthusiasts. So it's not just a showroom, but it's actually a place where you can go hang out. I don't really know why you would want to do that, but I saw one in Shanghai that had just opened when I was there at the end of last year. And, it's like a very fancy place in a very high-end mall, and you could sit down and drink coffee and talk to other car owners and talk to the staff and watch videos of what's coming up in NIO cars, the features that are being developed. So it's that kind of place. Xiaopeng is much more low-key because, again, their price point is only half of NIO, but they also sell their own cars.
I'm very curious about the Chinese customer. So how are electric vehicles viewed and perceived in China? Does the Chinese consumer actually just say, hey, we want to be environmental friendly, let's just purchase an electric car? Or are they saying that, hey, it's cheaper, there's subsidies, maybe I should buy an electric car?
Yeah, so most of the buzz I've read online, and when you talk to people in China anecdotally, it really seems to be not as much an environmental thing as just sort of a cost and function. So like I said, the traditional manufacturers, like you were earlier saying, BYD, their cars are priced very cheaply, right? Like $10,000, definitely well less than $20,000. So you see a lot of people buying a car in that price range because that's what they can afford. However, there are also a lot of quality issues with that type of price point. So actually, there's been a lot of reports how there's been backlash against electric vehicles on the part of Chinese consumers because the cars just aren't, functioning too well after a few years. That's on the low end. For most of the companies we're talking about today, though, the people who are truly trying to build China's Tesla competitors, those cars are much higher end, they're much better built, much smarter, and the subsidies are really what's affecting how Chinese people view cars, right? So as the subsidies are being removed, people are becoming a little bit more cautious about whether or not they should be shelling out so much money for a new car.
So I've alluded earlier that Alibaba backed Xiaopeng, Tencent backed NIO, and then Baidu backed Weimar. Is the electric vehicle market just another extension or proxy war between the Chinese tech giants, and what would you think, in your opinion, are their intentions behind the market?
I mean, yeah, I think that for the Chinese internet giants, for sure, they see the car as the next place where they can have a presence, right? It's sort of like the next big device now that smartphones are sort of at peak penetration. But it's not just, by the way, Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu. I was going to mention that Lei Jun's Shunwei Capital, which basically you can think of it as the Xiaomi investment fund, is actually in both NIO and Xiaopeng. Both of the founders know Lei Jun apparently on a personal level and were able to get his investment. But going back to, the internet giants being in this space, I mean, it's pretty natural. Like Tencent's motto, for example, is to connect everything. So it's very easy for them to explain to their public shareholders why they would want to invest in electric vehicles. And I think for Alibaba, they've always had intentions of being more involved in, anything related to the next frontier of technology. So I think for all of these companies, and Baidu, of course, being so heavy into AI and autonomous driving being a huge use case for AI, all of these have really natural narratives to extend into EVs.
It is interesting that the way how I've read about the EV market in China, it seems the conversation is still on electric vehicle, but it doesn't talk about the autonomous vehicle side of things. Is it because the self-driving technology has not reached the level that they can actually be able to trial and test? Or am I really missing something that maybe there's also discussion on autonomous vehicles? It's just that not as popular as when we talk about electric vehicles in China itself.
Maybe. I mean, I think, well, first of all, the electric vehicle startups are the ones who really raise like billions of dollars, right? All of the companies we mentioned have raised $2 to $3 billion, something like that. Just like in the US, you have Tesla talking about autonomous driving a lot. And then you have separate startups that are purely working on autonomous driving. And that's the same case in China. You also have a whole crop of startups that are not making their own cars, but are only making the software behind autonomous driving. And those startups look very different from the companies that we're talking about today. So maybe that's what you're referring to. I do know that in general, when companies such as Xiaopeng or NIO are talking to the media, they do talk about autonomous driving. But so far, from what I can see, Xiaopeng has talked about, level 3 down the road, but none of them are promising the same level of smartness, intelligence, or none of them are talking about robo fleets or anything like Elon Musk is here in the US. So maybe that's why you have the impression that they're purely focused on just the car itself and less on the driving technology.
And I guess it wouldn't be fair if I end the conversation without talking about the traditional car companies in China who have partnered with VW Group, who owns Volkswagen, or GM Motors, such as the collaboration with Shanghai Automotive Company, and also non-traditional car companies such as BYD, and also now with Tesla entering into China, I think through Shanghai. Mm-hmm. So I guess how do these players fit into this EV market within China then?
Yeah, like you said, Tesla has already opened their Gigafactory in Shanghai. And for the other traditional car manufacturers, basically all of them have an electric vehicle strategy in China. I would say they are a little bit behind. So, for example, the European manufacturer Renault has recently announced that they'll be manufacturing EVs in China. They actually, very interestingly, have a partnership with Alibaba. So it just goes to show again that the internet giants in China are involved in EVs, not just from an investment perspective, but also partnering with traditional car manufacturers. But the difference is that they are not as deeply involved, right? So, for example, the partnership with Renault and Alibaba is just going to help them sell cars and do marketing and sponsor their race cars, etc., versus invest in the subsidiary and actually take an equity stake. So I guess I would say pretty much, all the major manufacturers have a strategy and have already launched or are very shortly launching their own EVs in China. And of course, all these manufacturers are there because China is the largest EV market in the world.
Wow. So I guess the story of EVs in China, we have to continue to talk about, and probably you guys will cover the latest and the most hippiest things that are happening there. So I'm waiting for that. So Rima, many thanks for coming on the show, and thank you for extending the discussion on the state of EVs in China. And I've really benefited from it. In closing, my first question to you is, give me a recommendation that has impacted your life, both work and personally.
I've been reading Waking Up by Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a philosopher, meditator, and also neuroscientist trained in UCLA. And the book is basically on how to be spiritual without religion. And it's really great. I highly recommend it. He also has a podcast called Making Sense and an app also called Waking Up, both of which I subscribe to and I think are highly relevant for entrepreneurs and basically anyone who's interested in leading a more meaningful life.
And how do my audience find you?
Very easy. My Twitter is just my full name, which is spelled Ruima. I'm quite active on Twitter. And then if you are interested in hearing our podcast, it is available on iTunes under Tech Buzz China. And that's 2 words, Tech Buzz, 1 word, and then space China.
And it's in Pandaily, produced by SubChina.
Exactly.
And you can definitely Google me at Bernard Leong. And of course, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Acast, Luminary, Spotify, and Himalaya. This podcast is co-produced by Caroline and myself. And of course, tweet to us and give me your feedback. So once again, Rima, let's continue the conversation sometime soon and have a good day.
Thank you so much.